The wind howled through the narrow streets like a living thing. Snow blew across the empty alleyways of the small human colony, piling against doors and rusted metal walls. Most people were already inside their homes, wrapped in blankets and warmth, waiting for the brutal winter storm to pass. But in the middle of the storm, something cried. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even human. A thin, trembling sound echoed through the frozen alley, almost swallowed by the wind. A baby's cry. At the corner of a quiet street, an old woman slowly pushed open the wooden door of her tiny house. Her name was Margaret Walker, though most people in the colony simply called her Grandma Maggie. She was 72 years old, with silver hair tied into a loose bun and a thick wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She paused in the doorway. The wind slapped against her face immediately. For a moment she almost closed the door again. Then she heard it. That cry. Soft. Weak. Desperate. Margaret frowned. That can't be right, she murmured. No one would leave a baby outside on a night like this. The temperature had dropped far below freezing, and the storm was only getting worse. She stepped outside anyway. The snow crunched under her boots as she slowly moved toward the alley beside her house. The narrow passage was dark, lit only by a flickering streetlight struggling against the storm. The cry came again. Weak. Barely there. Margaret's heart tightened. Oh dear, she whispered. She hurried forward now, gripping the wall for balance as the wind pushed against her. Halfway down the alley, she saw something. A small bundle. Wrapped in a thin metallic cloth and lying beside an overturned crate. For a second she froze. Something about it felt wrong. This colony wasn't on Earth anymore. Humans shared this sector with dozens of alien species. Sometimes travelers passed through. Sometimes smugglers. And sometimes trouble. The bundle moved. The cry came again, shaking and fragile. Margaret didn't hesitate anymore. She rushed forward and knelt down in the snow. Oh, you poor little thing. Her old hands carefully pulled back the edge of the metallic blanket. Then she froze. Because the baby inside wasn't human. The infant was small, no bigger than a human newborn, but his skin had a faint bluish glow beneath the pale surface. Thin lines of light traced softly along his arms like tiny stars under his skin. His eyes were closed tightly. His breathing was shallow. And the cold was already turning his tiny fingers stiff. Margaret stared in shock for 2 long seconds. An alien baby. Someone had abandoned an alien baby here. In the freezing cold. Who would do such a terrible thing, she whispered. The child let out another weak cry, his tiny body trembling violently. That was enough. Margaret quickly wrapped the metallic cloth back around him and lifted him into her arms. He was so light. Too light. And frighteningly cold. Well, I'm not leaving you here, she said firmly. The storm roared louder as she stood up, holding the baby close to her chest beneath her shawl. Not tonight. Not ever. The baby's glowing skin flickered faintly as warmth touched him. For the first time since she picked him up, he stopped crying. Margaret hurried back toward her small house, shielding the child from the wind with her body. Behind her, the alley returned to silence. But far above the colony, hidden beyond the storm clouds, something moved. A massive shadow passed quietly across the night sky. And deep within a distant alien ship, a cold mechanical voice spoke. Search protocol active. Locate the lost heir. Target species, human custody suspected. Back inside her warm little home, Margaret Walker placed the alien infant beside the fireplace, wrapping him gently in a thick wool blanket. She had no idea what she had just brought into her house. She didn't know about the ships searching the sector. She didn't know about the hunters already tracking the child. All she knew was that a freezing baby had been left alone in the snow. And no child deserved that. Margaret looked down at the tiny alien curled beside the fire. Well, she said softly with a warm smile. I suppose you'll be staying with Grandma for a while. The baby's glowing skin flickered again. And for the first time since he was abandoned, he slept. Outside, the storm kept raging. And somewhere in the darkness of space, the galaxy had just begun looking for him. Rocket. The storm raged through the night. Snow hammered against the windows of Margaret Walker's small house while the wind whistled through the cracks of the old wooden walls. But inside, the little living room glowed with the warm orange light of the fireplace. Margaret sat quietly in her rocking chair, a thick blanket wrapped around her shoulders. In her arms, the alien baby slept. He was still tiny, barely the size of a human newborn, but now that he was warm, the faint bluish glow under his skin had become more visible. Soft lines of light moved slowly along his arms and chest like tiny rivers of starlight. Margaret had never seen anything like it before. She adjusted the blanket around him carefully. "Well," she murmured softly, "you're certainly not from around here, are you?" The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake. His skin was no longer ice cold, though it still felt cooler than a human child's. Margaret had placed a kettle near the fireplace and warmed some milk, unsure if alien babies could even drink it. But when she gently touched the bottle to his lips earlier, he had taken it immediately. Hungry. Very hungry. Now his tiny stomach was full, and he slept peacefully in the warmth of the fire. Margaret studied his small face. His features were different, but not frightening. His ears were slightly pointed, and faint silver freckles dotted his cheeks like tiny stars. His eyelashes shimmered faintly when the firelight touched them. "Someone must be missing you," she whispered. But deep down, Margaret wasn't sure that was true. Because whoever had left him in that freezing alley hadn't wrapped him properly. The thin metallic cloth he'd been covered with was clearly not meant for cold weather. Whoever abandoned him had meant for him to die. Margaret frowned. Well, they picked the wrong house for that. She gently rocked the chair back and forth. Outside, the storm continued to roar. Inside, the baby slept. Hours passed. Eventually, Margaret carefully placed the child in a small wooden basket near the fireplace. She filled it with soft blankets and one of her old knitted sweaters. The baby made a small sound but didn't wake. Margaret smiled. There now. Much better. She turned off the main lights and shuffled toward the kitchen to make herself tea. Behind her, the baby's skin began glowing slightly brighter. At first it was faint. Then the glowing lines on his arms slowly shifted, forming strange patterns like moving symbols. Tiny sparks of light flickered in the air above him. A spoon on the nearby table trembled slightly, then lifted a few centimeters into the air. The baby remained asleep. But the glowing symbols on his skin pulsed softly. The spoon hovered for 3 seconds, before gently falling back onto the table. Clink. Margaret turned around immediately. HM? She walked back into the room, glancing around. The spoon sat exactly where it had been before. Margaret tilted her head. Must be my ears playing tricks, she muttered. She checked the baby again. Still sleeping peacefully. Margaret chuckled softly. You're already giving Grandma a scare, little one. She returned to the kitchen. But the strange glow continued. Across the galaxy, inside a massive command chamber filled with holographic screens, several tall alien figures stood silently. Their armor shimmered with dark metal and glowing blue lines. At the center of the room, a projection of the sector map flickered. One small point on the map suddenly flashed. A signal. One of the officers stepped forward immediately. Energy signature detected. Another voice responded coldly. Confirm identification. The officer studied the readings. His eyes widened. It matches the royal genetic pattern. The room fell silent. Then the commander spoke. Location. The officer hesitated. Human colony. The commander's expression hardened. Prepare retrieval forces. Meanwhile, back in the quiet colony house, Margaret returned to the living room with her cup of tea. The storm outside had started to calm. She sat down beside the basket and gently brushed the baby's small hand. His fingers instinctively wrapped around hers. Margaret's smile softened. Well, she whispered. Looks like you've decided to stay. The baby shifted slightly in his sleep. His glowing skin dimmed slowly until the strange light disappeared completely. Margaret had no idea what she had just witnessed. She didn't know about the alien ships now moving toward the colony. She didn't know the child sleeping in her house was being hunted across the stars. To her, he was simply a baby who needed warmth. And Margaret Walker had already made up her mind. No matter what species he was. No matter who came looking. No one was taking this child out into the cold again. Rocket. Morning came slowly to the human colony. The storm had finally passed during the night, leaving thick layers of snow covering the streets and rooftops. The sky outside Margaret Walker's small house was pale gray, and the air still carried the biting chill of the long winter storm. Inside the house, the fire still crackled softly in the fireplace. Margaret shuffled into the living room wearing her thick robe and wool slippers, carrying a steaming mug of tea. She yawned. Well, that was quite a night. Then she looked toward the wooden basket near the fireplace. And smiled. The alien baby was awake. His large, glowing eyes blinked curiously as he stared around the room like everything was brand new. The faint blue light beneath his skin shimmered softly, almost like a gentle heartbeat. Margaret set her tea down. Well, good morning, little one. The baby made a soft cooing sound. Margaret leaned over the basket. "And how are we feeling today, him?" The infant stared at her for a moment, then suddenly smiled. A bright, innocent smile. Margaret's heart melted immediately. "Oh my goodness." She gently picked him up, wrapping him in a warm blanket. "You are just the sweetest little thing." The baby reached out and grabbed her finger again, just like he had the night before. His grip was surprisingly strong. Margaret chuckled. "Well, someone's feeling better." She carried him into the kitchen. "I suppose the first order of business is breakfast." The baby watched everything with wide eyes as Margaret warmed a bottle of milk. When she sat down and offered it to him, he drank eagerly. Very eagerly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Mercy, you must have been starving." Within minutes the bottle was empty. The baby made a satisfied little noise and blinked up at her. Margaret wiped his mouth gently with a cloth. "There we go." She rocked him slowly while looking out the window at the snowy street. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Quiet. Normal. Then something strange happened. The baby suddenly looked toward the living room. His glowing eyes narrowed slightly. Margaret noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" The baby lifted his tiny hand. The metal kettle on the stove began to rattle. Margaret blinked. Then the kettle slowly lifted into the air. Margaret froze. The kettle floated nearly a foot above the stove. Her eyes widened. "Oh my!" Clang. The kettle dropped back down loudly. Margaret stared at it. Then slowly looked at the baby in her arms. He blinked back at her innocently. Margaret placed a hand on her chest. "Well?" She let out a shaky laugh. "That's new." The baby giggled softly. Margaret stared at him again. "You're telling me you did that?" The baby simply grabbed her finger again. Margaret sighed. "Well, I suppose every child has their talents." But deep down, she knew this was something far beyond ordinary. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles above the colony, a massive alien ship drifted silently through space. Its dark metallic surface reflected the distant stars as dozens of smaller ships launched from its sides. Inside the command chamber, several armored figures stood around a glowing holographic display. The energy signal pulsed again. Clearer this time. Stronger. One officer spoke. "The child's power is increasing." Another nodded. "The royal energy signature is stabilizing." The commander stepped forward. His voice was cold. "That child should not be alive." Another officer asked carefully. "Do we retrieve him, or eliminate him?" The commander stared at the glowing point marking the human colony. After a long moment, he answered. "First, we confirm." He turned toward the soldiers standing by the doors. "Prepare a ground team." Back on the colony, Margaret was busy changing the baby's blankets near the fireplace. "You're going to need a name, you know," she said thoughtfully. The baby looked up at her, blinking slowly. Margaret tapped her chin. "Him?" She studied his glowing skin. Then smiled. "Well, how about Noah?" The baby kicked his feet happily. Margaret laughed. "Well, that settles it then." She gently picked him up again. "Welcome to the family, Noah." At that exact moment, high above the colony, 3 small alien drop ships silently entered the planet's atmosphere. Their engines made no sound. Their cloaking systems kept them invisible. But their destination was clear. One small human house. And the child sleeping inside it. The child who, according to half the galaxy, should not exist. Rocket. The morning passed quietly in the small human colony. Snow still covered the streets, and most people were busy clearing their driveways and sidewalks after the storm. Children threw snowballs, neighbors greeted each other, and life slowly returned to normal. Inside Margaret Walker's house, however, something far more unusual was happening. Margaret sat in her rocking chair again, gently bouncing the alien baby she had named Noah. "Well, Noah," she said warmly, "you're certainly keeping Grandma busy." Noah blinked his glowing blue eyes up at her. Since the morning, Margaret had already witnessed several strange things. A spoon floating. A chair sliding slightly across the floor. And at one point, the television had turned on by itself when Noah started crying. Margaret had decided something very important. She wasn't going to panic. After all, babies were babies. Even alien ones. Right now Noah was wrapped in one of Margaret's old knitted blankets, happily chewing on the corner of it. Margaret chuckled. "That took me 3 weeks to knit, you know." Suddenly, a low rumbling sound echoed through the sky. Margaret frowned. That's odd. The rumbling grew louder. Outside, several people in the colony looked up in confusion. Because the sky was changing. 3 dark shapes slowly appeared above the clouds. Massive. Silent. Alien ships. Gasps spread across the streets. People pointed upward. Some ran inside their homes. Others simply stared in shock as the enormous vessels descended slowly toward the colony. Inside Margaret's house, Noah suddenly stopped chewing the blanket. His glowing skin flickered. His small eyes turned toward the ceiling. Margaret noticed immediately. "What is it, sweetheart?" Then the rumbling sound became a deep, powerful hum. Margaret walked toward the window. And froze. 3 enormous alien ships hovered above the colony. Each one easily larger than an entire city block. Margaret's eyes widened. Oh dear. Outside, a beam of light shot down from one of the ships. Moments later, several tall armored figures appeared in the middle of the street. They weren't human. Their armor was sleek and metallic, glowing faintly with blue symbols. Their helmets hid their faces, but their movements were precise and powerful. The entire colony fell silent. One of the figures stepped forward. A device on his armor projected a loud, mechanical voice across the streets. "Attention human residents." The voice echoed through the entire colony. Margaret clutched Noah closer. "We are conducting a retrieval operation." People began whispering nervously. "Retrieval? For what?" The voice continued. "A missing child from our civilization has been detected in this settlement." Margaret's heart skipped. Her eyes slowly lowered to Noah. He stared back at her calmly. The voice boomed again. "Return the child immediately." Silence filled the colony. Neighbors looked at each other nervously. No one spoke. Inside the house, Margaret took a slow breath. "Well," she whispered. "I suppose they mean you." Noah blinked. The mechanical voice grew colder. "Failure to comply will result in forced retrieval." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Well now." She adjusted the blanket around Noah. "No one threatens my house like that." She walked toward the front door. Outside, dozens of colony residents had gathered at a distance from the armored aliens. Everyone watched nervously. Then the door of Margaret's house slowly opened. The elderly woman stepped outside. Holding the baby. The alien soldiers turned toward her instantly. Their helmets scanned the child. One of them spoke through the speaker. "Target confirmed." Margaret stood calmly on her porch. "Well, you certainly made quite an entrance," she said. The commander stepped forward. His voice remained cold and mechanical. "That child does not belong to you." Margaret held Noah protectively against her chest. "Funny thing," she replied. "Last time I checked, whoever left him in my alley didn't seem to want him." The soldiers remained silent. The commander spoke again. "The child is dangerous." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "This little thing." Noah yawned in her arms. Margaret gently rubbed his back. He's barely learned how to hold a bottle. The commander's tone hardened. "He must be returned." Margaret shook her head. "I found him freezing in the snow." Her voice grew firm. "You abandoned him." Several people in the colony began murmuring. The commander paused. Margaret continued. "And now you come down here with ships and armor trying to scare people." She crossed her arms slightly. "Well, I've raised 3 kids and 7 grandkids." She looked directly at the soldiers. "You don't scare me." The street fell completely silent. The commander stared at her for several seconds. Then he gave a quiet command. 2 soldiers stepped forward. "Retrieve the child." Margaret didn't move. Instead, she held Noah closer. "No." The soldiers stopped. The commander spoke again. "Human, stand aside." Margaret's voice was calm. "No." The soldiers began moving again. But before they could take another step, Noah's skin suddenly flared with bright blue light. The glowing lines across his arms pulsed like lightning. A powerful invisible force blasted outward. Whoom! Snow exploded across the street. The 2 soldiers were thrown backward several meters. The entire colony gasped. Margaret nearly dropped her tea earlier that morning when a kettle floated. Now she stared at the street in shock. "Well?" She glanced down at Noah. "That's new too." The alien soldiers slowly stood back up. Even the commander looked stunned. His scanning visor flickered rapidly. One officer whispered over their communication channel. "His power levels." The commander's voice turned grim. "Are rising." Margaret looked down at Noah again. He had already fallen asleep. Peacefully. as if nothing had happened. Margaret sighed softly. Then she looked back at the soldiers. "Well," she said calmly. "I believe that settles it." She gently rocked Noah. "You boys should probably go home now." But the commander knew something Margaret didn't. Because the child sleeping in her arms was not just any alien. He was something the galaxy feared. And now, they were absolutely certain. The missing royal heir had been found. And he was in the hands of a stubborn human grandmother. Rocket. The entire colony street was silent. Snow drifted slowly through the cold air, settling around the stunned alien soldiers who had just been thrown backward by a force no one could see. Margaret Walker still stood on her porch, holding baby Noah. He slept peacefully in her arms, wrapped in the thick knitted blanket, completely unaware that he had just knocked 2 armored alien soldiers across the street. Margaret looked down at him. "Well," she whispered, gently patting his back, "someone woke up grumpy." Across the street, the alien soldiers slowly stood again. Their armor scanned the area rapidly, glowing lines flashing across their helmets. The commander stared directly at the baby. His voice came through the translator again, but this time it carried something new. Concern. Energy levels confirmed. One of the soldiers spoke quietly to him. "Commander, the power spike matches the Royal Archive records." The commander's visor flickered. "Yes." He turned back toward Margaret. "Human, you do not understand what you are protecting." Margaret adjusted the blanket around Noah. "Oh, I understand plenty," she replied calmly. "You left a baby in the snow." The commander's voice hardened. "That child is not merely an infant." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Well, he certainly isn't paying rent." A few people in the crowd behind her laughed nervously. The commander ignored them. "He is the last heir of the Asterix Dominion." The colony residents exchanged confused glances. The commander continued. "His species once ruled hundreds of star systems." Margaret listened quietly. But their power became unstable. He gestured toward Noah. "Their children possess abilities capable of destroying entire cities." Several people gasped. The commander's voice lowered. Most of the galaxy agreed that the Asterix bloodline had to end. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You mean you tried to wipe them out?" The commander did not deny it. "The child you hold was supposed to be the final one." Margaret slowly rocked Noah in her arms. "And instead of raising him properly, you threw him in an alley." The commander said nothing. The crowd behind Margaret began murmuring angrily. One man stepped forward. "You left a baby to freeze?" Another woman shook her head. "That's messed up." Margaret spoke again. "He's not dangerous." Almost as if responding, Noah made a tiny sleepy noise and hugged the blanket tighter. Margaret smiled. "See." The commander's tone grew urgent. "You are wrong." He pointed toward Noah. "When he matures, his power will multiply thousands of times." Margaret looked at the baby. Then back at the commander. "Well, then I suppose it's a good thing he's being raised by humans." The commander paused. Margaret continued calmly. "We don't throw our children away when they're difficult." A few people in the colony nodded. The commander studied the crowd. Something unexpected was happening. Humans were stepping forward. Standing closer to Margaret. A man with a snow shovel stood beside her porch. A young woman crossed her arms beside him. More people slowly moved closer. No one said it directly. But their message was clear. "You want the baby? You go through us." The commander turned slightly toward his soldiers. "This is unnecessary." One officer whispered. "Commander, our orders were retrieval." The commander looked back at Margaret. Then at the dozens of humans now standing between him and the child. None of them had weapons. Most were still wearing winter coats and boots. But they were not moving. They were not backing away. They were protecting the baby. The commander finally spoke again. "Human grandmother." Margaret tilted her head. "Yes? You are willing to oppose the authority of the entire Galactic Council for this child?" Margaret looked down at Noah. He had woken up slightly and was blinking sleepily. She gently touched his cheek. "Well," she said softly. "Someone has to look out for him." The commander stared at her for several seconds. Then he turned toward his ship hovering above. After a long silence, he gave a quiet order. "Stand down." The soldiers froze. "Commander?" "Stand down." Slowly, the soldiers stepped back. The crowd of humans watched cautiously. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You leaving already?" The commander looked back at her. The child is powerful. He glanced at Noah. But perhaps power alone does not determine destiny. Margaret smiled slightly. Exactly. The commander nodded once. Then he signaled the ships above. Moments later, beams of light lifted the soldiers back into the sky. The massive alien vessels slowly rose higher into the clouds. Within minutes, they were gone. The colony street remained silent for a moment. Then someone laughed in disbelief. Another person clapped Margaret on the shoulder. "Well, Grandma Maggie," the man said, shaking his head. "You just stared down an alien invasion." Margaret looked down at Noah. He had fallen asleep again. She smiled warmly. "Oh please," she said. "I've dealt with toddlers worse than that." The crowd laughed. Margaret turned and walked back into her house, closing the door behind her. Inside, the fire still crackled softly. She sat back down in her rocking chair and gently rocked Noah in her arms. "Well," she whispered. "Looks like it's just you and me now." Outside the window, the snow began falling again. Far away in space, the alien commander watched the small human colony from orbit. One of his officers asked quietly, "Commander, should we report that the air has been secured?" The commander shook his head slowly. "No." He looked at the image of the small house where the child slept safely in human arms. "Report that the air," he paused, "has found guardians." Back in her quiet house, Margaret Walker gently kissed Noah's forehead. The baby who had once been abandoned to die in the cold was no longer alone, because the galaxy might have feared him. But humanity had done something very different. They had given him a home. Rocket.